Well, Mark Carney, our prime minister, has started a global dictatorship tour, if I may. He just touched down in communist China. His tweet announcing his arrival, of course, makes no mention of human rights, industrial sabotage, or democratic infiltration, what we saw in various elections, especially in Greater Toronto area. After he's done in China, he'll visit two other spots. One is Qatar, the tiny Gulf nation that is the chief sponsor of Hamas, now that Iran is running out of cash. And then he'll end the whole thing, well, where we're going to be, at Davos, at the World Economic Forum Summit. That's Mark Carney's kind of place. As you know, he was a director of the World Economic Forum for years, a very China-centric place. It's been a while since Canada has had a prime minister go to China, but Mark Carney is quite familiar with them. He's met with Xi Jinping himself as in his capacity as chairman of Brookfield Asset Management. And remember that Mark Carney has not divested himself of his stock. So he's going with two hats on. One, the Prime Minister of Canada, the other, a major stockholder in Brookfield Asset Management. But let's get back to the first point. How do we deal with China? It is a fact that they import a variety of Canadian exports, including, for example, canola, which they put under an enormous tariff. I understand that Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe has accompanied Mark Carney clearly with one thing on his agenda: get that import tax removed. The Chinese, of course, will want something in return, perhaps softening or removing the tariff on Chinese electric vehicles, a tariff brought in to protect Ontario's auto industry. But what about their meddling in our democracy? What about the Chinese consulate putting an actual bounty on a democratic opposition, an opponent, Chinese Canadian, in the last federal election? Will any of that come up? Well, there's one man who I would trust on this stuff more than anyone else. He's an independent journalist who has really made a name for himself on the foreign interference issue. You could probably guess who I'm talking about. His name is Sam Cooper. He's the boss of The Bureau. You can find it at thebureau.news, and he joins me now. Sam, thanks very much for coming back on the show. You're so busy. I'm grateful to have a few moments of your time. Put aside Qatar and the World Economic Forum. Tell me what we should be watching with Mark Carney's trip to China.
Well, I think Michael Kovrig, who your viewers know very well, was kidnapped in the Man Wanzhou pressure case. He's been very vocal, Ezra, in the past week, airing out his well-founded and hard-earned knowledge of what Carney could be up to in China. And Mr. Kovrig laid it out. He said Jean Chrétien was there a week before Carney in Beijing. Jean Chrétien has deep business ties and has had for decades with Beijing. He's there, according to Mr. Kovrig, the expert, apparently to pave the way for what may be possible in business dealings. And so, as you said in your intro, it's no secret now to Canadians that China is up to no good in our country. But I think the real story is here that not only is Mark Carney through Brookfield deeply exposed in his own business dealings to China. I think, Ezra, we've talked about how Mr. Carney scored a $250 emergency loan on a Brookfield real estate investment in China in 2024. That's shortly before he replaced Justin Trudeau. So I testified about that in Parliament as being a potential conflict. But beyond that, as Mr. Kovrig and I and others have noted, powerful business industrialists connected to Jean Chrétien in Montreal have essentially been writing Canada's China policy for decades. And Mr. Kovrig, I and other experts think they're the ones that are driving, that will be driving sort of the agenda for Mark Carney in his visit to Beijing. And that worries me and a lot of experts on China.
You know, I remember when Jean Chrétien announced he was going to go work in China. If my recollection is accurate, he announced that publicly just 6 weeks after he finished his term as PM. I think there was no way he didn't know in advance that was his plans. I don't think he was silent, incommunicado, and then suddenly when he was done being PM, he negotiated. I think he was warming to China the whole time, but in any event, for 20 years, he has been deeply involved in China with the Desmarais family that his own child married into. So he's full on in China, but you've got to say, okay, he's a businessman now, he's a lobbyist now. he's sort of a grand figure in the Liberal Party, but he really hasn't been, I don't think, an advisor to the government in Canada. But him meeting with the Chinese in advance of Mark Carney, that really feels like he was there to soften the ground, to shape the battlefield, so to speak. And so I think my question is, will this serve liberal interests, personal interests, corporate interests, Desmarais interests, Chrétien interests, or will it serve the Canadian interests? Because I think they're different. I have no problem with Canada trading with China. It's impossible for us not to. But what I'm worried about is that everything will be skewed to favor the in-group, the Chrétien crowd, the insiders. And remember that Carney himself is still an insider with those shares. I'm just worried that instead of a political deal, we're getting a business deal done by the state, but for the benefit of the few.
That's my worry. And, 5 to 10 years ago, a lot of people could still claim this sounds like a conspiracy theory, but it's not anymore. Ezra, you mentioned canola. I reported on a CSIS document for the Bureau.News in the wake of my revelations at Global News on election interference. This was really not noticed, but it said CSIS assessed that during the Mun Wanzhou crisis, China's Ministry of State Security was putting maximum pressure on Canadian industrialists because they believed that the industrialists had maximum leverage with senior Canadian politicians, re. Justin Trudeau. This CSIS document, and people can go to the Bureau.News, assessed that China was calibrating its election interference in 2019 to secure the release of Mun Wanzhou. And they were calibrating their support across all three major political parties while still supporting Justin Trudeau. Let me underline that. The document says Justin Trudeau was favored by China, but to show that China was a little displeased with Mun's detention, they started to scatter their election interference goodies around to different parties. And again, let me underline, Richardson's in Saskatchewan, a big grain trader, was mentioned in that document. And as you say, and I think I agree, the Quebec industrialists would be even at the higher level of the pyramid of influence with China and influence on Mark Carney, Jacques Chrétien. Even some conservatives such as Brian Mulroney probably had that similar influence.
I understand Mark Carney's argument. He's saying we have to diversify our export markets because the United States tariff position is confusing and scary. And Trump just this week was saying he doesn't know if he wants to renegotiate the USMCA trade deal. I can understand why, whether you're left wing or right wing, that means diversify. That said, 80% of our exports go to the States, only 5% to China. And by the way, what China, I think, really wants from Canada is our raw materials. They want our coal, our potash, our oil. And we haven't really built the proper infrastructure. Like, we haven't built an oil pipeline. It's certainly not one that looks like it'll be speedy. I'm also, but my point is, by wooing China, by bending the knee to China morally, I'm worried that the United States might have a bad reaction to that if they think we're getting too chummy, if they think we're abandoning the U.S. orbit. This, instead of diversifying our exports, this might actually lead to some backlash. And listen, Canada's an independent country. I don't want it to be a puppet of the U.S. But do you think there's a risk that if Mark Carney is too friendly with Xi Jinping, that might get a reaction from Marco Rubio?
Ezra, I absolutely believe that's the case. And let me point to a great story that you and your network broke. That was the Chinese PLA training in Canada's Arctic. That's the exact type of episode that my sources, who are at a senior level in the US government, also good people in Canada's government, say. Canada has not only been in bed with China, with Jean Chrétien and his business friends in Montreal for decades. Remember, this started with Pierre Trudeau, who recognized the CCP over Taiwan. And as a new book reveals, that set a bad model for the rest of the world. This is the concern of the American government, who I believe is up every hour of the night these days, planning for a potential, the shock scenario of a war with Beijing that over their plans to attack Taiwan within the next year or two. And so Canada, by Mark Carney, Of course, we need to be sovereign. We need to get the best deal. President Donald Trump is being very bellicose, harsher than any recent American president, but they are protecting their interests. And I'll circle back to that great story you broke about the PLA training in the Arctic. Look, Ezra, we both know when we're talking about Trump wanting to buy Greenland, China and Russia are already involved in Canada's Arctic. This is a major concern. And Mark Carney scoring deeper trade deals, that's sending us on the road to destruction very quickly, I believe. I'm afraid.
Yeah. You know, I mean, Trump has an audacious style. I really recommend to people to read his old book called The Art of the Deal, which was pre-politics. I mean, he was always political, but it was about how he likes to negotiate. And he talked about making outrageous demands, then backing down, so his strong demands appeared very, very modest by comparison. He talks about putting the other guy off balance by saying, you know, throwing out curveballs. If you read how he did business in New York City, which is a very cutthroat real estate environment, you can see some of those traits at work now. And I don't think he denies them. I don't think anyone actually thinks the United States is going to have a military war with Denmark. I just don't think anyone believes. But by making that a huffing and puffing threat, everything else seems moderate. And I noticed, by the way, there were Danish and Greenlandish diplomats in the White House today. So we'll see what happens there. And Trump talks about China's presence. And I don't know. I think that Canada could actually do more things, interesting things. Let me throw something at you. And maybe it's outside your wheelhouse, so maybe you don't have an opinion on it. But look, there is a U.S. military base in the UK, in Italy, in Germany, in Turkey, in about 100 countries in the world. And you could say, oh, that violates their sovereignty. Well, those countries would say, no, it gives us actually the benefit. Canada doesn't have a U.S. base here, even though Americans do train in some of our military bases. If we had a joint Canada-U.S. base in the Arctic, let's say near Inuvik, or even further north, at Tuktoyaktuk, where Americans and Canadians could train and work together in the Arctic, it would be allies, buddies. I'm not saying 51st state. I'm just saying let's have what Germany has. They have 40 U.S. bases. Let's have an Arctic base co-located with the Americans where we train with each other, not with PLA, Chinese communists. I think Trump would value that so much. It would be like an asymmetrical thing. Maybe he'd go easy on our auto industry. Maybe he'd go easy on other things. I don't know. But I think that I don't know if Mark Carney can do that because he's taking a bit of an anti-American tone. Just something that we could tip our hat to the Americans and say, yeah, listen, let us sell our oil or our wheat or our potash, our canola, and we'll help you on the Arctic sovereignty, which we agree with. Anyhow, it's an idea. I just wanted to float that idea and hear what you thought of it.
I love the idea. I've had similar ideas, and I would add to that, we should be not signing exclusive deals, but signing heavily weighted deals where we are providing our critical minerals to the United States for, you know, them to. Ezra, let me tell you what I think the Western Hemisphere and the world is all about now. The U.S. government bought into globalism over the past 30, 40 years. China snuck in and secured all the critical minerals needed. They've captured the supply chain. So if that war happens, the U.S. government will run out of munitions very soon. Mm-hmm. They're in a race to secure critical minerals and to secure Western Hemisphere military security dominance, really, because they're preparing for war with China. So 100%, let's do those bases together with the Americans. These are our natural allies. As people, we're very close. We're not identical, but I have the opinion that we can never really be separate from the United States in terms of an ally. Saying that we're going to be European or China adjacent, it'll never work. So yes, stronger military cooperation and interoperability, stronger sharing on resources. This is what the people in Canada deep down, I think most of them really want, and it makes sense at a high strategic level.
Let me ask you one last question, and it's actually totally a different part of the world. It's in Markham, Ontario, part of the Greater Toronto area. There are different camps of Chinese communities. Some are, you know, absolutely freedom-oriented, dissident, you might even say democracy activists. But then there are those who favor the Chinese Communist Party. And there are, I'm not going to say street battles, but it's certainly a tug of war. And you saw that where Michael Ma was elected as a conservative, but was wooed somehow by Mark Carney, and one of his opponents, Joe Tay, is real. There's this really interesting battle playing itself out. It's a peaceful battle so far, thank God, between who sort of is the boss on the ground. And Michael Ma was flipped from the conservatives to the liberals, and now he is on that plane in China. His immediate reward was to get an audience with the dictator. And I think that's in poor taste, by the way. I think it's an insult to the people of Markham who voted for a more freedom-oriented candidate, and then they're given to someone who's being wooed by the Chinese communists. What signal does it send that as a reward for turning tables, Michael Ma is now visiting with a top dictator?
It's a horrible signal, and that's a deep story. I believe, Ezra, that first of all, Mark Carney, I've documented at the Bureau through photographic evidence and open sources that Mark Carney was meeting with people that should be on the Foreign Agent Registry because they are senior Beijing United Front Work Department political operatives that appeared to give Mark Carney support in his nomination. I similarly documented that Michael Ma, without alleging that he's involved in any under-the-table dealings, he's been meeting more than once with very senior people that should be on Canada's Foreign Agent Registry when it, in fact, if it's ever implemented, these are people, Ezra, that I'll assert to you are extremely key to the Don Valley North election interference story and the election interference across Canada. Michael Ma, toasting wine glasses with them, wearing a red scarf in front of, images of Beijing's military in Markham, which you point to. I think it's a hugely concerning issue. Again, not alleging Michael Ma is involved in foreign interference, but I have the concern his floor crossing could be connected to Beijing's interference.
Yeah, it sure looks that way. Well, Sam, I really value your journalism. And folks, as you know, Rebel News is an independent citizen journalist outfit, but we love to pay attention to other citizen journalists and to host them on the show sometimes. Can I recommend that you bookmark Sam's website, especially if you care about foreign interference, Chinese-Canadian relations, and other things too. The website's really easy to remember. It's thebureau.news, thebureau.news. And Sam's got an interesting style. He's got a ton of sources on the ground and in institutions who trust him to get the news out when maybe sometimes the regime media are reluctant to tell what's really going on. So I really look up to Sam, and we're always grateful he can take a few minutes. I know he's so busy. I see him, on so many different programs. He's in demand, so we're always happy when he clears his schedule for us. Sam, great to see you. Keep up the great work, and we look forward to our next update with you.
Always good talking, Ezra. Thanks.